here to honor Latinas, who are the unsung heroes of the American story. Latinos, Latinas, and Latinx people have lived in America for centuries, many immigrating here like so many others to build a better future for their children and their grandchildren. But when they arrived, conditions were hardly welcoming or equal. During the Great Depression, our government turned its back on immigrant families. Whipping up fear that immigrants were taking jobs, our government initiated Mexican repatriation, deporting hundreds of thousands of Latinos, both American citizens and undocumented immigrants, to Mexico. Then during World War II, the government reversed itself, welcoming thousands of Latino soldiers into the military and recruiting thousands more for the Bracero program for Mexican workers to help the war effort and to work on the railroads. And these were very much one-way relationships. Latinos were often excluded from GI benefits, while Bracero workers were paid poverty wages and forced to live in subhuman conditions. After the war, Mexican Americans were often robbed of the opportunity to pursue education, to start a business, to buy a home. And in the 1950s, the U.S. reversed itself again and deported more than 1 million Mexican nationals, including U.S. citizens. The use and abuse of Latino and Latina labor continued almost 2 decades after the war ended. But by the 1960s, workers came together to demand change. Now, many of us know the story of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. The National Farm Workers and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee and the nonviolent protest movement that rose up against greedy grape growers in the farmlands of Delano, and eventually pierced the conscience of our nation. The movement ultimately inspired immigrant workers, Latinos and Latinas, to mobilize for change. And I want to talk about that change right here in Los Angeles. I want to tell a story, not just as a teacher or even as a candidate for president. I want to tell the story as the daughter of a janitor. In the years after World War II, many cities had unionized janitors. But over time, building owners who had once managed and hired their own janitorial staff were bought out, replaced by giant corporations that outsourced their cleaning services. Now, those giants sought out non-union workers, undocumented workers, women workers, anyone with less power. Wages were cut, hours were extended, basic benefits were stripped away. 2 very different worlds began to emerge. By day, thousands of executives and real estate brokers and lawyers poured into Century City, Los Angeles, filling meeting rooms and boardrooms and making million-dollar deals. They crunched numbers, made pitches, and after a day of deal making, they headed out to their homes in the suburbs. But as they sat in their bumper-to-bumper traffic on the way back to their plush lives, hundreds of workers clocked in to LA's largest office buildings to clean up after them. The janitors, mostly women, mostly immigrants from Mexico and Central America, settled into the back-breaking work all through the night, cleaning tall windows, mopping long, narrow hallways, and dragging pounds of garbage from the top floor down to the loading dock. Now, no strangers to struggle, many of the janitors believed their circumstances would never change. They would forever be stuck in a world they described as luxury by day, sweatshop by night. And then, one day, a few upstart organizers from the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, showed up with a simple message about power. They started with numbers. There were more hardworking janitors than there were corporate CEOs. And if the janitors stood together, they could wield enough power to make real change. Now, at first, the workers were skeptical of the union. Some were even afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of being deported. Many of the Latina janitors had left their home countries in Central America, fleeing violence that, in some cases, had been caused by U.S. interventions that had destabilized the region. And like so many women, the Latina janitors were encouraged not to speak loudly. So quietly, over time, the Latina janitors began to share their stories with each other. Maria Quintanilla was one of those janitors. In 1980, she fled the civil war in El Salvador. A mother of 2 boys, she held on to her dream of becoming a teacher. So on the weekend, she took classes at UCLA to inch toward her degree. Rosa Ayala also worked long hours for little pay. She saved every penny she had in a big plastic bottle, which she emptied each week to care for her family. And Anya Fieles worked not 1, but 2 jobs to send money to her aging mother and her children in El Salvador. Now, these women began speaking publicly to demand more rights for all workers. They proved the lesson that when women start telling their stories, change is on the way. And the courage they showed inspired other janitors to come off the sidelines. As their numbers grew, they worked with SEIU to form organizing committees and demand improvements on the job. They wanted 3 things: higher wages, better benefits, and the ability to sit across the negotiating table as equals. Now, the women didn't have to go it alone. SEIU was there, and SEIU enlisted help. Community leaders, activists, and members of the clergy joined in walkouts and sit-ins and strikes that began to disrupt daily life here in Los Angeles. Now, of course, there was pushback. As more people learned about the struggle of the janitors, the corporations called in local law enforcement to confront the strikers and their supporters. Tensions escalated. Marches caused traffic jams. Garbage was dumped in the heart of Center City. And public confrontations dogged building owners at posh restaurants. Yeah. The janitors and their allies were bold, and they were fearless on their own, but they were also union trained and deeply committed to nonviolent civil disobedience. Their demonstrations may have filled their bosses with rage, and they may have inconvenienced the city, but they were also peaceful. Even so, weeks after the janitors began taking to the streets, police began making arrests to intimidate the workers into submission. And then it happened. On June 15, 1990, 400 janitors and their allies took to the streets in a peaceful protest. They put on their red shirts and they marched under the banner, "Justice for Janitors." Now, to avoid any misunderstanding, union leadership and community organizers had met with law enforcement ahead of the march and underscored their peaceful intent. Police officers agreed that as long as the march was peaceful and orderly, there would be no issues. Then, when the crowd of 400 marched from Roxbury Park in Beverly Hills to Century City for an organized rally, they were met by 100 police officers fully decked out in riot gear. With courage and purpose, the janitors stepped forward. Law enforcement tightened ranks in front of them and then ordered them to disperse and turn back. Janitors refused. Whistles pierced the air as the police declared the march to be an unlawful assembly. But the marchers held steady. They locked arms and, in an act of civil disobedience, sat down in the middle of the street. They prepared to be arrested. But the police did not begin arrests. Instead, they descended on the demonstrators, beating them with billy clubs and forcing them to the ground over and over. For half an hour, Women and men, children and grandparents were brutalized by police officers in broad daylight. By the end of the confrontation, 42 janitors were arrested and 21 were hospitalized. One of those in the hospital included Ana Valles, who had recently learned she was pregnant. While Ana was on the ground, she was clubbed 3 times in the back by the police, and 4 days later, she had a miscarriage. As word of the brutal assault spread across LA and around the nation, the police claimed they acted in self-defense, but news footage of the brutal beatings showed a very different picture. The mostly immigrant, mostly Latino and Latina janitors were unarmed, peaceful, and certainly no match for the force of the LAPD. The janitors then faced a choice: retreat or continue with the protest. With 21 of their brothers and sisters in the hospital, they resolved to carry on. They showed up on the streets of Century City, Los Angeles the next day and the next day and the next day, determined to make their voices heard. And day by day, thousands of supporters and national civil rights leaders, including the Reverend Jesse Jackson, joined the janitors on the streets of downtown LA. The intense publicity of the Century City protests turned the nation's attention to the poverty wages that drove janitors to the protest in the first place. And just 2 weeks after the first brutal attack, SEIU negotiated a contract that gave janitors a raise, benefits, and a seat at the table. And listen to it. Latinas had led the fight and Latinas had won. Now, the story of resistance teaches us 3 powerfully important lessons. First, the fight for justice is never one and done. 5 years before the janitors took to the streets of LA, union membership had been in sharp decline.